8 o'clock hour. But right now, we go to Washington, D.C., where we are joined by Congressman Michael Guest. Good morning, Mr. Congressman. Are you staying warm with all the snow in D.C.?
Look, I am. As a native Mississippian, seeing 6 to 8 inches of snow is something that I've never experienced. But staying warm, they're doing a good job of keeping the sidewalks clear to let me get to work every day. And look, we were able to get into work yesterday. We were able to certify the election, a key procedural step to making sure that the pathway is cleared for Donald Trump's inauguration on January the 20th.
Paint the picture for me yesterday. This is it's in some ways ceremonial. It is supposed to be almost a rubber stamp event, but it's something that's very important yesterday. So it's a joint session of Congress. Everybody there in the Capitol. Just kind of paint the picture of what it was like yesterday being on the floor as the election was being certified.
Yeah, so occurs, of course, every 4 years in the House chamber. The Senate comes to the House chamber. It is a joint session. It is presided over by the Vice President. So this year, Kamala Harris presided over the election certification. The states are called individually by alphabetical order. And then after each state is called, members would have the chance to lodge an objection. There were no objections lodged to any of the states when they were called this year. The total session lasted really just over half an hour, Richard, so it was extremely short. But they would call out each state. They would announce the winner of each state, the number of electoral votes that state gave to the winner of their state, and then at the end, there is a tally done of all the electoral votes that were obtained by each candidate, and then a winner is announced. And so a very different certification this year than we had 4 years ago. Of course, 4 years ago, there were challenges to really just two states. When people talk about the election certification 4 years ago and that the election was challenged, what was actually challenged was the election certification of two states, being the state of Arizona and Pennsylvania. And there were election challenges just to those states, not to the other 48, but had no challenges this year. So, as you said, very ceremonial procedure this year, but again, an essential hurdle that the Constitution requires so that we can clear the path for President Trump to be sworn in 2 weeks.
You know, politics being what it is, when they got off to the side, you had Democrats who had things to say, and they were quick to talk about January 6th and how this was going to be a peaceful transfer of power and all of those things. And one of the things that people kept pointing to is this is going to be so incredibly awkward for the vice president because she was the candidate for the Democrats, and she lost handily. What did it feel like? Did it feel awkward, or does Kamala Harris deserve some credit for being professional and being, I don't know, showing some level of humility in this?
Well, I mean, she did the job that she was elected to do, and this is an essential role that she has to perform as vice president. I'm sure she would have rather have been anywhere else than in the House chamber having to certify the election, which she lost in November. But, you know, I will give her credit. You know, she was there. She did what she was supposed to, and she made sure that the boxes were checked. You know, being on the floor, of course, there was great enthusiasm from the Republican side, a great amount of applause as states were called where Donald Trump won those seats. There were also a spattered applause from Democrats in seats that Kamala Harris won, but everyone knew that this was the Republicans' day, that Republicans won the election. We won with what I would say would be a mandate from the American people. And now we're ready to get President Trump sworn in, and we're ready to start making good on the campaign promises from November.
Well, no, I certainly want to get to that in just a moment. There was a hurdle that had to be cleared before yesterday for yesterday to come off, and that was election of the Speaker of the House. And it ended up happening on the first vote. There are people that have opinions that are all over the place about Mike Johnson and whether or not he is conservative enough, whether or not he is enough of a Republican. Take us through that voting process. There was the hour-long delay when it looked like it was going to be a couple of votes short on the initial ballot, and then everybody kind of got in line. Thomas Massie, the only dissenting vote from the Republican side. Talk to me about Speaker Johnson and whether or not he is going to deliver for Republicans, deliver for conservatives versus just delivering for the president.
Yeah, what I'll say before we talk about the election process is just talking about Mike in general. Mike is a great individual. He's somebody who loves his country. He's a deep man of faith. He's somebody who wants to do the right thing. He wants to see this institution being more member-driven than being leadership-driven. And he's somebody who President Donald Trump has faith in, and somebody who President Trump believes can lead our party and can lead the House of Representatives for the next at least 2 years, and hopefully if we keep the majority 4 years, or during a Trump presidency. And so I think Mike has probably the hardest job, not only government, but maybe all of America. He's herding 435 House members who all have different priorities, different agendas. He will be operating, Richard, in one of the smallest majorities, if not the smallest majority in modern history. For your listeners, on January 20th, when President Trump is sworn into office, there will be 2 Republican House members who resign their seats to take jobs in the administration. And with those 2 resignations and currently the open seat of Matt Gaetz, who chose not to be sworn in, House Republicans will be down to a single seat majority. So that means any single Republican could have problems with legislation, and if they chose to vote with the Democrats, they could prevent legislation from passing off the House floor. And so Mike has an incredibly difficult job. I'll tell you that I think he has done the job as well as anyone could. Why anyone right now would want to be Speaker of the House, I would just tell you that that is a job of great frustration. But President Trump has taxed him to be his Speaker, and I, along with other members of the Mississippi delegation, Mike Ezell, Trent Kelly, we voted for his speakership on Friday.
Visiting with Congressman Michael Guest. He is with us from Washington, D.C. this morning. So we know that politics is maybe more polarizing than it has ever been. But a key difference that I see between Democrats and Republicans, when there is legislation that is on the floor that not everybody agrees with, they go to the press and they talk about it and they fight amongst themselves, they being Democrats. But that when it comes time to vote, everybody seems to get in line more times than not. And they vote as a block and they get things done. Republicans, on the other hand, seem to fight among themselves and not necessarily agree, okay, this is conservative, but it's not conservative enough, or it's not nearly conservative enough. And then when it comes time to vote, they don't necessarily line up and everybody play on the same team. How does that change, or does it need to change?
Well, I think part of the reason you see that is, I think there's just generally a fundamental difference between Republicans and Democrats in the fact that I think the Democrats, they want to be led. They want their elected leaders to tell them the position that they need to take, and then they are very quick to fall in line behind their elected leadership. I'll tell you that I think the difference between Republicans and I think Republicans in general, we're fiercely independent. We don't like people telling us what to do or how to vote or whether or not we should support this legislation or oppose this legislation. We like to be able to make up our own minds. We like to be able to look at it, to weigh the pros and cons of the legislation, to see the impact it's going to have on our district back at home. And I think that fierce independence that we have at times, while I think overall is a great thing, at times it hurts us being able to come to consensus on whether or not legislation should be passed or not. And so I think that is the fundamental difference between the two. I think what is going to drive this Congress that we didn't have last Congress, Richard, is the fact that we've got Donald Trump in the White House. America has elected him to be our commander-in-chief. He is the coach of our team. And when he calls the plays, he expects us to execute those plays. And so if President Trump has legislation that he is supportive of, that he thinks would be in the best interest of this country, if he and his administration are pushing that legislation, it's our job then to craft the legislation, make the legislation as good of legislation as we possibly can, and then to deliver it and get it across the finish line in the House so that then we can transfer that legislation to the Senate, and hopefully it will pass the Senate and on to the President's desk. So,
Congressman, forgive me for interrupting. Have you got time to hang on through the break?
Yes, sir. Be happy to.
All right. We'll be right back with more from Congressman Michael Guest. Sometimes those commercial breaks just get in the way of a good conversation. We're glad to be with you as we wrap up the 7 o'clock hour on the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk Mississippi with Congressman Michael Guest. 2 weeks from today, an inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump in Washington, D.C. Probably going to be cold, maybe be raining, but not sure it's going to dampen the spirits in D.C. Congressman, let me throw you a message that we got on the C-Spire text line. I think this is an interesting question, and it feels like it harkens to years gone by. Will good legislation not cross party lines anymore? I get tired of hearing this side or that side. And it feels to me, I'm kind of adding to the text, like there was a time where that was the way the Congress governed. Yes, Republicans believed one thing. Yes, Democrats believed another thing. But compromise existed, and more times than not, the Congress tried to get things good for the done for the good of the country. Is there a scenario where we can get back to any of that?
As you know, as it relates to legislation in general, I mean, there's legislation that passes through the House and Senate every day of more minor relevance, if you will, Richard, than major legislative issues that passes through sometimes with unanimous consent. And so we are routinely passing legislation, again, maybe not having the big impact that some of the more controversial legislation will have, but we are able to work together on those issues. Where we see that division is major issues, maybe something like the border, where there is a great divergence in philosophy. Republicans want to secure the border. We want to make sure that we have an immigration policy that where if we're allowing people in the country that there's a process, that they aren't allowed just to come across the border and make an asylum claim and then stay in the United States for years, if not decades, waiting for that to play out. On those major issues, on things such as border, asylum, the Trump tax cuts that we want to renew as Republicans, that we're going to see great pushback from Democrats. The fact that Republicans want to see an increase in military spending to offset what we're seeing with nations like China and Russia, Iran, North Korea. Those major issues, it is more difficult to work together. And I think that is twofold. I think one is we've got the 24-hour news cycle. And so we've got Fox News, we've got CNN, we've got MSNBC. They're constantly have information out there. And then with social media. With social media, we know that it is an ability for people to receive instant feedback. There's often misinformation, which is on social media, which will drive people's opinion one way or the other. And I'll tell you that once information gets out on social media that is inaccurate, it is very difficult to convince people otherwise.
Yeah.
And so
with
the 24-hour news cycle, with social media, it does make it harder to find common ground on those controversial issues that divide Democrats and Republicans.
One last thing. We've got a couple of minutes left. I don't know if you know this or not, but your name was in the news a lot a couple of weeks ago as chair of the House Ethics Committee as it pertains to the Matt Gaetz report. You did not want that released. You were a dissenting voice on that, but ultimately the Ethics Committee decided to release that report As you reflect on that process and how it went down, what can you share with us?
Yeah, this was a protracted investigation that began before I became chairman of the Ethics Committee. The investigation had originally been put on hold at the request of the Department of Justice as they were looking at potential criminal charges. The Department of Justice later decided not to pursue charges, at which time the Ethics Committee was able to pick back up and finish the investigation. And we were preparing to finalize the report when Matt Gaetz was originally tapped to be the Attorney General nominee for President Trump. Matt Gaetz then resigned from Congress. He later withdrew his nomination to be the Attorney General, and so that created a split within the committee as to whether or not a report should be issued or not. I will tell you that the tradition of the committee is that when members resign from Congress, that not only does the Ethics Committee lose jurisdiction, but we do not issue reports on members that are no longer members, or on individuals who are no longer members of Congress and upon whom the committee has lost jurisdiction. I felt very strongly that this case should be handled like all of the many other cases that we deal with on a regular basis. There are a handful of exceptions. I think the last time Congress issued a report on a member who had left was some 15, 16 years ago, and so there are a handful of 3 or 4 occasions that individuals could point to that would be what I would call a break in the tradition or a break in the precedent. But as a former attorney, I feel very strongly on precedent, and we should do things in every case, and we should treat every person the exact same way. I felt like in this case, because there were people who did not necessarily like Matt Gaetz, that people were allowing that to kind of influence their decision. But look, I felt strongly enough that not only did I vote against releasing the report, but I was the author of the minority views and came out very strongly on my position that I felt like it was improper for the committee, that I felt like the committee was being weaponized by us issuing this report after Matt Gaetz had left Congress, and I felt that